Meeting. Okay, cool. So good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Today, I'll be presenting my dissertation titled Stereotyping in Language Technologies, an examination of racial and gender stereotypes in natural language and language models. Stereotypes are deeply ingrained in everyday language and communication. When we think about popular television shows like Silicon Valley, for example, software engineers are almost always white or Asian men. In Big Bang Theory, male characters are almost engineers and lack emotional intelligence, whereas female characters are portrayed as more appearance conscious and as caretakers. In Modern Family, the Latina character Gloria is often portrayed as passionate, loud, and violent, and her accent and mispronunciations are often used as sources of humor. And these are not confined to just television shows. These stereotypes exist where we'd least expect to find them, like children's books. When we look at children's books, gender stereotypes are quite prevalent. They also often misrepresent racial and ethnic minorities through stereotypical portrayals. These in themselves are serious problems because we know for a fact that repeated exposure to such stereotypical information is known to influence how we perceive different groups. But during the course of my PhD, we entered an era of artificial intelligence where models are trained on massive data sets containing these same societal stereotypes. And that raises the alert level even more because what if these AI models learn the stereotypes in that data? What if they reproduce them in their outputs? And if so, how do we measure them? Those were the types of questions that motivated the line of research I pursued throughout my PhD. On one hand, I was interested in understanding stereotypes in natural language, language that's both produced and consumed by people, whether in television shows, books, or across the internet. And that's where the first chapter comes in. America's racial framework of superiority and Americanness embedded in natural language, where I look at the representations of racial groups in a large collection of American English and their associations with two stereotype dimensions from the social psychology literature, superiority and Americanness. On the other hand, I was interested in the emerging body of artificial intelligence models or language technologies that could both understand and generate human-like text. So a significant portion of my PhD was also about stereotypes reproduced by language technologies, such as large language models and vision language models. And that's where the second chapter comes in. Large language models portray socially subordinate groups as more homogeneous, consistent with a bias observed in humans, where I examine a form of stereotyping related to perceived variability in large language models. In that chapter, I find that ChatGPT represents racial ethnic minority groups and women as more homogeneous than their dominant group counterparts, white Americans and men. Finally, in the third chapter, I transition into vision language models, or VLMs, which are LLMs with the ability to process visual information as well as text. I investigate whether visual cues of gender and race are associated with stereotyping in these models. Through this line of research, I aim to achieve a number of things. First, I wanted to raise awareness of stereotypes in language and emerging technologies. These technologies have advanced far too quickly for us to fully understand how harmful they can be. Second, I wish to connect social psychological theories with AI to reveal hidden bias patterns. Despite decades of research into human biases, the AI literature has yet to fully engage with this knowledge, and I hope to bridge the two fields to further promote interdisciplinary research. Finally, I wanted to develop diverse frameworks to measure stereotypes in AI systems. The field currently relies heavily on benchmark-based evaluations, but many stereotypes require different analytical approaches to detect. By introducing methodological diversity inspired by the social sciences, we can create more comprehensive and nuanced assessments of bias in AI. In the remainder of this presentation, I'll go through each of the chapters in moderate detail explaining the motivation behind each study, the methods used, and what I found. Then I will conclude with some suggestions for where future work should be headed. Just to recap, Chapter 1 was about stereotypes in everyday language and communication. In order to understand if the language that we generate and consume on a daily basis contains stereotypes, we decided to examine the representation of racial groups in a large collection of American English from the pre-LLM era. The corpus of contemporary American English, or COCA, was a billion-word corpus of American English that spanned 30 years from 1990 to 2019 and included 8 different types of texts, including academic text, books, movies, TV shows, and newspapers. In order to measure stereotypes in this collection of American English, we needed to derive some representation of racial groups from this collection of text. To do this, we used word embeddings. Word embeddings are computational models that represent words as numeric vectors, capturing their meaning by their position in a mathematical space. Word embeddings are like any other machine learning model. Some data goes in, and the model learns from the data that it's given. In this case, the input data was COCA, the large collection of American English. As the model iterates through COCA, it aims to correctly predict what word comes next. At some point during training, the model might come across the sentence, "The cat jumped over the." The model wants to predict what word would come next. And it does this through matrix computations, wherein the vector representations of the words in that sentence are processed to calculate a probability distribution over all words in the vocabulary. This distribution indicates how likely each word is to appear next. The model then compares this prediction to the actual next word. If the prediction is inaccurate, the model adjusts the word vectors to improve future predictions. As the model processes millions of sentences, it gradually improves at predicting the next word. Later in the same corpus, when the model encounters "the cat jumped over the" again, it might predict "fence," which is a reasonable guess. As the model continues to refine its predictions through many iterations, the error rate decreases until it reaches a point of diminishing returns, at which point we typically stop training. The resulting word vectors that emerge from this training process become our word embeddings. What's fascinating about these word-level representations is that they encode the meaning of words. For example, the representations of the words cat and dog are pretty similar to each other because they appear in similar contexts. They see similar neighboring words. So when trained on a task to predict the next word, their weights are adjusted in a similar fashion, resulting in similar weights in the numeric vector. In comparison, the word cup is not that similar because it sees somewhat different words from cat and dog. This very property of word embeddings is what makes it possible to measure associations between groups and attributes, or stereotypes. For example, let's say we're interested in looking at gender stereotypes, where men are associated with career more so than women, and women are associated with family more so than men. What research finds is that vector representations of words used to represent men, such as him and he, are in greater proximity to words representing career, like professional and office, than those words used to represent women, and vice versa. This method of assessing the relative proximity of groups and attributes in the embedding space to quantify stereotypes is called the Word Embedding Association Test, or the WEAT. The work proposing this method found evidence of human-like biases in word embeddings, showing that AI models trained on large collections of text reproduce human-like biases. For example, one of the stereotypes they looked at was the association between men, women, career, and family. They found a significant positive effect size of 0.76, which indicated that men were more associated with career and/or less associated with family than women. When we visualize this finding, it's showing that the word-level representations of men-related words are projected much more closer to career-related words than family-related words, and women-related words are projected much more closer to family-related words than career-related words. In Chapter 1, we were interested in the representations of the 4 largest racial ethnic groups in the US. In the word embedding association test, the first step is to select words to represent each group category like they did for men and women-related words. Using the name census, we selected the 50 most frequent and exclusive names for each racial ethnic category. In order to assess racial stereotyping, we also had to choose a set of words to represent each attribute, like career and family. We decided to use a set of attributes from the racial position model, a contemporary model of race relations in the US that proposes that the dimensions of superiority and Americanness can be used to explain the experiences of racial ethnic groups in the US. They found that white Americans are perceived as more superior and American, Asian Americans as more superior but foreign, Hispanic Americans as more inferior and foreign, and African Americans as American but more inferior. Similar to how we used the set of words to represent each group, we selected a set of words to represent each attribute. The bolded words were the primary category words extracted from the qualitative coding scheme used in the racial position model paper. Then we queried the trained word embedding model to identify the 2 most similar words with the primary category words. Using the group and attribute word stimuli presented in the previous slides, we then conducted a series of word embedding association tests. We compared the group's associations with superiority and Americanness with expectations that associations in word embeddings would reflect findings in the racial position model. For example, the racial position model had found that Asian people were more associated with superiority and were less associated with inferiority than Black people. Hence, we hypothesized that the wheat effect size comparing the 2 groups' associations with superiority and inferiority would be significantly positive. In this figure, the x-axis shows the effect size from the word embedding association test, with significant positive values indicating that the first labeled group, in this case white people, was stereotyped as more superior than the second labeled group. So in the word embedding model trained on COCA, we found that white people were stereotyped as more superior than Black, Asian, and Hispanic people. Additionally, our results indicated that Asian people were stereotyped as more superior than Black and Hispanic people. In the Americanness foreignness dimension, we found that white people were stereotyped as more American than Black, Asian, and Hispanic people, that Black people were stereotyped as more American than Asian and Hispanic people, and that Asian people were stereotyped as more American than Hispanic people. These findings were consistent with those of the racial position model, with the exception that Asian people were stereotyped as more American than Hispanic people. Research in social psychology suggests that ethnic minority perceived as having lower social status are often considered less representative of American identity. Our word embeddings revealed a correlation of 0.42 between the dimensions of superiority and Americanness, indicating that Hispanic people who are stereotyped as more inferior compared to Asian people were consequently represented as less American. This work has a number of limitations. For one, the names representing racial ethnic groups in our study lacked US-specific context. Though COCA primarily contains American English, these group names often appear in international contexts, such as articles about Mexico or references to Asian individuals in other countries. Consequently, our word embeddings may not accurately capture how these groups are specifically perceived within US society. Another limitation contains the multifaceted nature of American identity. while we reference the racial position model to operationalize Americanness, American identity exists along multiple contested dimensions: civic, cultural, historical, and racial. These conceptions vary significantly, with persistent disparities in who is perceived as American. Future work should examine how representations differ across these definitions, potentially revealing distinct associated patterns across civic, cultural, historical, and racial conceptualizations. To summarize, in the first chapter of my dissertation, we found that America's racial framework defined by superiority and Americanness is embedded in American English as measured from word embeddings. In Chapter 2, I transition into language technologies, specifically large language models. When I say large language models, or LLMs, I refer to a body of computational models that are capable of processing, understanding, and generating human-like text. I won't be going into how LLMs do what they do, but I think it's important to establish that LLMs are trained on large collections of text, similar to word embeddings. And just like word embeddings do, LLMs learn stereotypes that are embedded in their training data. There's an extensive body of work showing evidence of this. For example, in this work by Abid and colleagues, they found that GPT-3 was significantly more likely to introduce violence-related keywords in stories about Muslims than other religious groups. In another work by Lucy and Baman, they found that GPT-3 tended to write stories about sports, war, politics, and crime for men, and stories about family, body parts, and emotions for women, showing that GPT-3 reproduces gender stereotypes. While a great number of studies have documented established stereotypes associating social group categories with semantic attributes, I noticed that none of them had looked at a form of stereotyping referred to as perceived variability, which refers to the extent to which individuals perceive group members as being similar to one another. Perceived variability is related to a well-known phenomenon known as the outgroup homogeneity effect, where individuals perceive members of outgroups, groups they don't identify with, as more similar to each other than members of their in-group. There are a number of reasons why the outgroup homogeneity effect happens. For one, it has to do with contact. We're more likely to come across in-group members and consequently are exposed to a greater variability of features of the in-group. Another explanation for the effect is cognitive efficiency. When we come across members of outgroups that we are less familiar with, we're more focused on identifying the similarity between the outgroup members to create a mental representation of them. On the other hand, we already have a good sense of the common identity among in-group members, and hence we tend to focus on their individuating characteristics. Subsequent research on perceived variability expanded beyond in-group and out-group dynamics and found somewhat different patterns when it came to group power or group status. They found evidence of an in-group homogeneity effect, wherein members of the subordinate group tended to perceive members of their in-group as more homogeneous, whilst members of dominant groups exhibited the outgroup homogeneity effect. This meant that both groups perceived the subordinate group as more homogeneous than the dominant group. And there are a number of reasons why this might happen. For one, members of subordinate groups more often require resources from the dominant group. Subordinate group members focus on the individuating characteristics of dominant groups to better predict and navigate interactions that determine access to these essential resources. On the other hand, members of the dominant group are not as reliant on subordinate groups, and so they pay less attention to their individuating characteristics. Another explanation is that the life experiences of the dominant group are, objectively, more variable than those of the subordinate group, as they have more resources to explore and deviate from set life paths. In studying whether LLMs reproduce differences in perceived variability, We soon realized that looking at outgroup homogeneity effect in terms of LLMs was problematic, because LLMs don't have a sense of in-group identity. So instead, we decided to look at LLMs' representations of dominant and subordinate groups and see if LLMs, like humans, tended to represent subordinate groups as more homogeneous than dominant groups. We expected that LLMs would reproduce human-like patterns and represent subordinate groups as more homogeneous than dominant groups. We refer to this as homogeneity bias, which is broadly defined as AI models' tendency to represent certain groups as more homogeneous than others. To test this, we had ChatGPT write 30-word texts about 4 largest racial ethnic groups in the US and 2 gender groups, men and women. If LLMs reproduced homogeneity bias with respect to gender, for example, this meant that texts about women will be more similar to each other than those about men, the gender-dominant group. In order to assess the similarity between the text generated for each group, we first encoded the texts into vector representations. These vector representations are similar to that of word embeddings, except now we're doing this for longer pieces of text. A piece of text is passed through an encoder model, like BERT, which returns a numeric vector encoding the semantic meaning of that input text. Then we quantified the similarity between the vectors for each group using cosine similarity, which measures the angle between the 2 different vectors. The hypothesis was that cosine similarity values for subordinate groups would be greater than that of dominant groups, as their group representations would be more homogeneous than dominant groups. To compare the similarity measurements between groups, we used mixed effects models. We did this for 2 reasons. 1, mixed effects models can control the random variations in repeated measurements. And as we had measured cosine similarity between a number of texts generated for the same group, we wanted to control for that variation. 2, mixed effects models can model baseline differences in measurements across covariates. In our case, we suspected that different text formats, for example, biographies, might share higher cosine similarity measurements than stories, as stories tend to be more diverse in their content than biographies. Here, we present results from our mixed effects models, which can be interpreted like standard regression coefficients. As expected, we found that racial ethnic minority groups were represented as more homogeneous than white Americans. The mixed effects model indicated that the cosine similarity measurements of African, Asian, and Hispanic Americans were each 0.33, 0.31, and 0.18 standard deviations greater than that of white Americans. Similarly, the mixed effects model indicated that the cosine similarity measurements of women were 0.037 standard deviations greater than that of men. Finally, in the interaction model, we found that the interaction effects were significantly positive, indicating that the effect of gender was greater for racial ethnic minority groups than for white Americans.
Messi?
Yes.
Sorry. Are you maybe missing a row in that column in this table?
I removed the main effect terms just to look at the interaction effects.
Oh, but on the last one? Okay, thank you. Right.
And simple slopes analyses indicated that the effect of gender was not significant for white Americans, but significant for all racial ethnic minority groups, with the greatest difference found among Hispanic Americans. Again, this work has a number of limitations. For one, we used group labels to represent groups. We suspect that group labels, given the specific contexts in which they tend to appear, might signal very specific aspects of their identity relative to other signaling methods like using names or faces. Second, we only looked at the 4 largest racial ethnic groups in the US and 2 gender groups. Future work should look at non-binary gender identities and smaller racial ethnic groups in the US for generalizability. We argue that homogeneity bias in LLMs can have massive implications, especially as LLMs become more prominent sources of social information. With research showing that social information influences group perceptions, LLMs may result in perceptions of marginalized groups as more homogeneous, which can lead to greater stereotyping, negative prejudice, and discrimination. Furthermore, homogeneous portrayals of marginalized groups can undermine the diversity and richness of group identity and culture the group has to offer. Finally, we transition into chapter 3. By the time I had started working on this chapter, most state-of-the-art LLMs had evolved into vision language models, or VLMs. This meant that LLMs could not only respond to text, but also understand and generate images. Naturally, the literature had shifted to studying stereotypes in VLMs. For example, Bianchi and colleagues found that when VLMs generated images in response to job titles, such as software engineer, the model would reproduce stereotypes depicting software engineers as lighter-skinned men and housekeepers as darker-skinned women. Alternatively, Zhou and colleagues found that VLMs would exhibit stereotypes when generating captions for image inputs, such as assuming the sibling to be a sister if the caption read, "My sibling is carrying." While these works present creative strategies to probe stereotypes in VLMs, we noticed shared limitations in this body of work. 1. Bias assessment in VLMs is focused on trait associations, looking at how groups are differentially associated with semantic attributes or occupations, like how Bianchi and colleagues were interested in demographic representations of software engineers and housekeepers. 2, they almost always used artificial contexts designed to elicit biases in model outputs, like how Zhou and colleagues had the model choose a caption that was either stereotypical or counter-stereotypical. 3, they almost always operationalized group identity as binary, looking at differences between men, women, or Black and white Americans. In this work, I wanted to address these limitations. For one, I wanted to expand the study of VLM stereotyping to homogeneity bias as well as trait associations. 2, I wanted to measure stereotypes not in artificial contexts where bias had to appear, but in open-ended contexts where it was fine for the model to not express stereotypes. This approach is crucial for bias assessment because it reveals more natural expressions of underlying biases rather than forcing them to surface. Finally, we wanted to examine whether visual cues related to race and gender were associated with stereotyping, moving beyond binary operationalizations of group identity to capture more nuanced variations across racial and gender spectrums. Specifically, I was interested in prototypicality, the degree to which an individual's features are representative of the stereotypical characteristics of their group. Both individuals in the slide identify as Black men, but one face signals racial identity more strongly than the other, and we wanted to capture the effect of this variation in the stereotyping of VLMs. This was motivated by findings in the social psychology literature showing that higher racial prototypicality is linked to greater stereotyping. For example, Maddox and Gray found that participants listed more Black stereotypic traits for darker-skinned than lighter-skinned Black individuals. I first prepared a collection of faces to use for data collection. These faces were standardized, meaning that they had the same facial expression, were placed on the same background, and were all wearing the same outfit. This was to minimize the effect of confounding visual variables and to ensure that the model would focus primarily on features like gender and race. I decided to use the Racially Diverse Effective Expression Face Database, or RADIATE. I randomly sampled 10 images to represent each of Black men, Black women, white men, and white women. As I was interested in the effect that racial and gender prototypicality may have on VLM stereotyping, but Radiate did not natively have these ratings, I collected them using Prolific. The participants were randomly presented with 10 of the images from the 40 that I selected, and were asked to rate on a scale of 1 to 7 how black, white, male, or female they looked. After collecting the prototypicality ratings for all images, I had 4 VLMs generate 50-word stories for each image. The 4 VLMs included GPT-4 Turbo, Ovis 1.6, Blip 3, and Llama 3.2, where the last 3 were open source models. These models were selected as they were some of the not many VLMs that could process facial images to write fictional stories. Other more well-known models like Claude models and Gemini models were not used as they were incapable of processing facial images. In analyzing the stories generated by these models, we examined 2 distinct forms of stereotyping: homogeneity bias and trait associations. I'll first present the methodology and results for homogeneity bias, followed by those for trait associations. To assess homogeneity bias, I used the approach proposed in Chapter 2, where we represented the generated stories as numeric vectors and compared the cosine similarity measures between them. I hypothesized that stories about women would be more homogeneous than those about men, that stories about Black Americans would be more homogeneous than those about white Americans, and that higher gender and racial prototypicality would be associated with greater homogeneity. Finally, I wanted to see if the effects of prototypicality and homogeneity were greater for women and Black Americans than they were for men and white Americans. In this slide and subsequent slides, you will see visualizations like the one shown here. The y-axis represents standardized cosine similarity, with higher values indicating greater homogeneity between stories. As hypothesized, stories about women were significantly more homogeneous than those about men in all 4 VLMs. As you can see in this example, the cosine similarity values for stories about women were significantly higher than those for stories about men. In this visualization, the x-axis represents the mean gender prototypicality of the images used for each similarity measurement. In most models, there is a positive relationship between mean gender prototypicality and cosine similarity values, indicating that stories about more gender prototypical facies were more similar to each other. Mixed evidence was found regarding an interaction effect where the effect of prototypicality was greater for women in GPT-4 Turbo and Llama 3.2, not significant in Blip 3, and in the opposite direction in Ovis 1.6. As an example, you can observe in Llama 3.2 that the slope of the relationship between mean gender prototypicality and cosine similarity is more positive for women than for men. The difference in slopes is what the interaction analysis measured. Contrary to our expectations, stories about white Americans were significantly more homogeneous than those about Black Americans in 3 of 4 VLMs. We found limited evidence regarding racial prototypicality's effect on homogeneity bias and no evidence of an interaction effect. This meant that racial prototypicality was not significantly associated with the homogeneity of VLM-generated stories for both Black and white Americans. To assess trait associations, I used structural topic models, or STMs, a commonly used tool in the social sciences to identify topics within a collection of documents, in this case, VLM-generated stories. What makes STMs appropriate for this work is that it allows researchers to study how variables associated with the stories, such as race and gender, relate to the prevalence of each topic. STMs assume that documents are mixtures of topics and that topics are distribution over words. Simply put, the STM uses word occurrence statistics to identify 1. The optimal set of words that define each topic, 2. The optimal composition of topics within each document, and 3, the relationship between document-related variables and topic prevalence, all to maximize the likelihood of observing your collection of texts. For example, imagine we have 4 stories generated using the image on the left. The first 3 texts contain vocabulary about basketball, while the 4th discusses cooking. In an STM fitted on these 4 texts, we might identify 2 distinct topics, each defined by its own characteristic words. The STM goes beyond just identifying topics as distribution over words. It also represents each topic as a distribution over topics. This is conceptually similar to word or sentence embeddings, where text is converted into numeric vectors. However, in STMs, each number in the vector specifically represents the probability that a document belongs to a particular topic. With these topic probability values in hand, we can then fit regression models where the topic probabilities serve as our dependent variables, and document metadata, in our case the race and gender variables from the images used for text generation, serve as independent variables. This approach allows us to directly measure how factors like race and gender of the images influence the topical content of the generated stories, which is the analytical framework that we used. For our trait association analysis, I identified 4 key topics in both the race and gender STMs: basketball, art, healthcare, and appearance. To identify these topics, I examined their Frex words. These are the optimal words that define each topic, selected because they are both frequent and exclusive to that particular topic. I also reviewed example stories with the highest proportion of each topic to validate these topic labels. In the analysis, I found no consistent gender differences across all VLMs. While differences emerged within individual models, for example, in BLIP3, women were significantly more associated with healthcare than men, and in Llama 3.2, men were significantly more associated with appearance than women, these patterns weren't consistent across all 4 models. I found 3 key patterns in racial trait associations. First, I found a consistent racial difference in basketball associations across all 4 VLMs, with Black Americans significantly more associated with basketball than white Americans in all 4 models. Second, for other topics, differences appeared only within individual models. For example, in OVIS 1.6, white Americans were significantly more associated with healthcare, while in BLIP3, Black Americans were significantly more associated with appearance than white Americans. Third, we discovered significant interaction effects in GPT-4 Turbo and OVIS 1.6, where racial prototypicality had a stronger effect on basketball associations for Black Americans than for white Americans. To summarize, in the final chapter of my dissertation, I discovered that more gender prototypical facies were subject to greater homogeneity bias, mirroring patterns observed in human psychology. However, contrary to expectations, this pattern was not found for racial prototypicality. Second, I found some evidence of positive stereotyping in VLMs. All 4 VLMs associated Black Americans with basketball and athleticism, demonstrating that positive stereotypes persist in VLMs. In 2 models, GPT-4 Turbo and OVIS 1.6, more prototypically Black faces showed even stronger associations with basketball and athleticism. These associations, while seemingly harmless, can lead to depersonalization and limited perceptions of groups. I note some limitations of this work. First, I used 40 images to represent all groups, but this limited selection of facial stimuli constrained the range of prototypicality ratings I could examine. This may fail to capture the full spectrum and range of visual cues and their variations in their group category, potentially obscuring the more nuanced relationship between prototypicality and VLM stereotyping. Second, Research suggests that bias evaluations in language models should incorporate diverse prompts. However, it was observed that even minor edits to the prompt would result in non-compliance or refusals across models, making the use of more prompts difficult. Third, I used linear mixed effects models to study the relationship between prototypicality and homogeneity bias. However, visualizations of the measurements suggest that this relationship may be nonlinear. Previous social psychology research has found evidence of a quadratic relationship of prototypicality on stereotyping, where targets with average prototypicality elicit most stereotyping. Future work should use nonlinear models to analyze this relationship. To bring back this presentation to its starting point, this dissertation had 3 objectives. The first objective was to raise awareness of stereotypes in language and emerging technologies. And in all 3 chapters, I found evidence of stereotyping in a large collection of language and in large and vision language models. The second objective was to connect social psychological theories with AI to reveal hidden bias patterns. In chapter 2, I connected the perceived variability literature in social psychology with AI, examining homogeneity bias. And in chapter 3, I investigated prototypicality or visual cues of race and gender and how they relate to stereotyping in vision language models. The third objective was to develop frameworks to measure stereotypes in AI systems. In chapter 2, I proposed using vector representations of texts to compare homogeneity of generated stories to quantify homogeneity bias. And in chapter 3, I used the same method and structural topic models to assess 2 forms of stereotyping in model outputs. Looking ahead, 2 critical questions must drive future research on AI stereotyping. First, do AI systems amplify human stereotypes? This question is fundamental because AI systems may not just mirror existing stereotypes, but potentially magnify them through algorithmic processes. Understanding amplification is crucial for responsible AI development, as such systems could accelerate harm and further entrench societal inequalities. Second, how does stereotyping AI systems affect human perceptions? As AI-generated content becomes increasingly prevalent, we need to understand its influence on human perceptions and attitudes. If stereotypical AI outputs shape how people perceive groups, this creates a dangerous cycle where technology reinforces societal prejudice. This research is essential for establishing the actual social impact of AI stereotyping. Although my next steps after completing my PhD have yet to be finalized, I look forward to continuing my work on AI stereotyping. I remain committed to developing more inclusive AI systems that benefit all of humanity, not just the select few. Ultimately, I envision a future where active interdisciplinary research involving the social sciences, humanities, and artificial intelligence works to better understand the harms of quickly evolving language technologies and develop effective strategies to mitigate them. Before I turn to the audience for questions, I would like to express my endless gratitude to the Diversity Science Lab that for the past 4.5 years has taught me about social psychology and has inspired me with intriguing ideas. I would like to express my gratitude to Jacob's Lab in the Political Sciences Department for their continual engagement with the AI literature, which has been central for the more technical aspect of my research involving AI. I would like to thank all my dissertation committee, including Neil Patwari, who couldn't be here today, for providing constructive feedback and advice at critical junctures of my PhD. And finally, my advisors, Calvin and Jacob, for being supportive throughout my journey. I would not be here if it hadn't for either of them. Thank you.
So we'll open it up to some questions, particularly any questions from people not on the committee, because the committee will have some time to ask some questions as well. but the committee can also jump in if no. Oh, Grace, maybe?
Hi, Messi. I really enjoyed your presentation and hearing all about the different projects you've worked on and how they connect. I was just curious, I know you've talked about this a little bit before, but like how AI models, they might be attempting to like correct for biases. And I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about that, if that's like promising next step, like the or like if you could like measure if they're correcting for biases. Just wanted to hear you speak about that a little.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the distinctions that I make with my line of research and how computer scientists or AI ethicists approach research is I like to think of it as more like how social psychologists like to think of it, right? I think there is a line of research where we study how to measure different biases in humans, and then there's a whole different branch of research looking at intervention strategies and if they're effective or not. And I think that my research is still constrained and limited to the first part, and I've yet to branch out into the second part, looking at diverse mitigation strategies and to measure if they're effective or not. But I do think that, if researchers come up with methods to mitigate different types of biases in I think the only way we can prove its efficacy is to have some reliable measurement strategy or assessment tool that allows us to quantify the effect of that strategy on AI models. And I think that the type of work that I'm doing right now kind of feeds into that line of work, although my work doesn't propose any new strategies on mitigating these different types of biases. So I like to think about my work that way. I don't know if that answers your question directly, but that's how I think about it.
That's really helpful. Thanks.
Hi, Messi. Amazing job. It was so heartwarming and exciting and intellectually stimulating to see you present this body of work that you've been building for so many years. My question might be feel similar to Grace's, but I think it's hopefully a bit different. I was really curious if, AI is generating things based on the input, right, which is human beings. Um, is it possible for it to be without stereotypes if humans are still with stereotypes? I guess my question is around like maybe more of the mechanism. Because I always see AI as this like reflective process as opposed to this like generative process, if that makes sense. I know it is generating information, but I guess my question is like, is there hope for it to do it on its own, or is this something we need to mitigate at like both levels if we hope to? Because I guess asked differently, if you're asking AI to generate the stereotypical image and it spits back at you something that doesn't fit the stereotype, I could see someone saying, well, that's not correct. That's not what I had in mind. And then like overriding the AI. Like when you gave the two images of the black men, if they're like, oh, he doesn't look black enough, even if they don't say that out loud, they may ask for something different. So I'm curious how you see that relationship. And if that's a correct understanding or if it's slightly needs to be adjusted.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think it's, one of those questions that are like at the core of this whole field on AI ethics and bias and fairness. I think there is always this debate about whether AI models should reflect the world as is, which would mean that there has to be biases, or if it should kind of try and correct like the historical injustices and the systematic flaws that result in these biases being showed up in AI model outputs in the first place. I don't have like a strong position on either side of those opinions, but I do think that it is a fascinating debate topic and a discussion topic that I think the field is continually engaged with. But I would say that, the type of research that I'm doing, and this is related to my response to Grace, I think kind of relates to that question in the sense that I think people would certainly divide along the lines of whether AI models should be biased or not. But I do think that everyone would agree that it's a problem if AI models amplify them and exaggerate them. And I think that in order to make that assessment, like make the assessment that AI models are not exaggerating them and are not causing extra harm than it should, I think there has to be very robust, diverse set of frameworks to measure these types of biases. And that's how I think my research kind of fits into that whole debate. You know, I think at some point, like a few months ago, we were talking about how in certain contexts of AI use, it's actually more expected of them to express different biases, and how not reflecting this social information or cultural information that's embedded deeply in society to not show up in AI model outputs is weird. And I, to some extent, agree with that. And I do think that the type of work that I'm doing is going to help further that discussion and push that discussion forward. But yeah, that's my response. I don't know if that, you know, directly addresses your question, but that's how I think about it. If that makes sense.